talk about Rembrandt's self-portraits, and it's really only with Rembrandt that you can say we're going to talk about the artist's self-portrait. I mean, he's the first artist that you can really do that with.
Certainly, since portraiture had emerged as an independent genre of painting in the 1400s, other artists had made self-portraits. For most other artists, it was an occasional thing.
Right, like Raphael put himself in the School of Athens.
Right, or even sometimes independent self-portraits, but none with the incredible regularity that Rembrandt did.
Yeah.
Something like over 60 of them, usually more than one a year.
Yeah, so he's really sort of taking it as a kind of project for himself.
And it actually makes a lot of sense if we think about what we know about Rembrandt and the development of his professional identity, because he was very self-conscious about forming a identity. Rembrandt, the painter.
Yes.
And so he develops this characteristic Rembrandt style, but it makes sense in his great interest in his identity that he would also make a lot of self-portraits as well.
Yeah, and he has to also sort of deal with the market in Holland, and he's making a name for himself as a portrait painter.
Right.
So he's spending a lot of time thinking about what it means to make a portrait and a likeness,
right,
and how to go beyond the sort of normal portrait tradition and do more with painting a face and a likeness. So this is a really early...
This is an early one from 1629.
Yeah.
He's only about 23 years old, and already we can see his kind of hallmark characteristic features, not only in painting in general, but also in his approach to portraiture. For instance, the great tenebrism, the bright light that shines directly on the face where the rest of the painting seems to dissolve into loose shadows.
Right, and which seems like a very Baroque characteristic to me, that kind of very stark contrast of light and dark.
Yeah, and you can see
being very dramatic about the lighting.
Very much an influence of Caravaggio in the north here.
Yeah, and there's also a kind of immediacy to it that I think of as very Baroque. In other words, he looks like he's really sort of right there. He's alive. He's maybe just about to talk to us and greet us.
Yeah, and even in this early painting, this early portrait, we can see what's typical of most of Rembrandt's portraits. Even though there's a kind of economy of paint and he's not using a lot of tiny details, he still communicates the identity and the personality of the sitter, here himself, in a very engaging way, where he really seems to leap out at you.
Yeah, very lifelike.
Very, very lifelike. And again, also in terms of general characteristics, there's a rather painterly application of the paint, although at this very, very early stage in his career, it's not as exaggerated as it'll be very shortly.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, let's look at the next one.
Here's another one from a little bit later.
This is from 1640, and Rembrandt's 34. And I like this portrait because it always looks to me like a very middle-aged kind of portrait to me.
Yeah.
It looks to me like he's established himself as a portrait painter in Amsterdam. He's successful. He's got students. He's making money. He's got commissions. He's amassing an art collection. He's buying a house. He's taking a wife. He's doing the things that one does as one gets into one's 30s. And it also looks to me like he went out with all his money and bought himself some really nice clothes.
Well, we know that he loved dressing people up. And so whether it's
dressing
himself or other people that come to his portrait studio, the idea of getting dressed up and posing for a portrait is something that appeals to him, even in terms of the act of posing itself.
Yeah.
And something else to recognize here in terms of you're saying that he's showing himself being successful as an artist is the way that this pose and even the outfit to a certain extent recalls Renaissance self-portraits.
Absolutely.
Like people by Titian, paintings by Titian rather, or
Raphael.
Raphael. He's inserting himself into a great line of major artists from the past.
Yeah. And I think, though, that even though that there's a sense of confidence that comes from his pose and the luxury of the clothing that he's wearing, if you look at his face and his eyes, there's something kind of vulnerable, something very self-aware there about sort of capturing himself as he moves through time, from his youth toward his middle age, toward his old age. There's a sense of poignancy there that I think that's always there with Rembrandt's portraits.
That's right. So let's look at a little later one. This is a portrait from 1658. Rembrandt is 52 years old. This painting is at the Frick Museum in New York City. And again, we could talk about the same kinds of things. It shows him with this great attention to light and shadow, and how the light falling mostly on the face and the hands brings the figure out of the dark background with the use of tenebrism.
But the figure is sort of coming apart a little bit now because the paint is much more loosely
applied. You can see
applied.
already that his approach has a much looser, rougher application of paint. And this painting is interesting for a couple of other reasons, too. This painting is pretty unique among his self-portraits, and all self-portraits.
Yeah, he's frontal. In fact,
he's completely frontal.
We hardly ever see that pose in any portraits.
Exactly. Usually most people in portraits are represented, even if their face is looking frontally, their body is turned in a three-quarter pose. Right. The only people who are ever represented completely frontally usually are kings, dukes, other people at the very top of the hierarchy. Combined with the robe that he's wearing and the chair that he's sitting in and the stick that he's holding in his hand.
Which sort of feels reads almost like a scepter, like a king would hold.
Exactly. It's clear that Rembrandt, it's not just an accident that he looks like a king. He's presenting himself here as a king.
Yes.
Dressed up in some of the outfits that he kept in his studio, in this chair and holding what looks like a scepter. He is the king, but he's specifically, I think, the king of painting. Because that scepter that he's holding is not a scepter at all. Think about what a king would actually hold. It wouldn't be a little stick like that. So Rembrandt here is the king of painting, because the stick that he's holding is not what a king would actually hold as a scepter.
It's actually something artists use, right?
It's a tool that artists use when standing at the easel and painting. It's a stick that they hold in usually the left hand, and then they rest their right hand on it so that their arm doesn't get tired as it's up in the air.
Lean it against the canvas, right?
Exactly.
And so they have something steady to
rest their arm on while they're painting. And so that stick that he's holding, it's a scepter, but it's a painting tool, and that really helps us understand him as specifically the king of painting.
And also, if you look at how that hand is represented, it's so much about paint. I mean, it almost barely looks like a hand.
It doesn't even really look like flesh. And you could say that a little bit about his face, but especially that hand.
Especially compared to the other one.
It seems to be flesh dissolving into paint, and like you said, if we compare it to the other hand, the difference is very noticeable. Now, there's a couple of reasons why it might be painted so differently from the other hand. We have to remember that this is a self-portrait, not a portrait. And so normally, if it were a portrait of someone else, the hand there that's holding that stick would be that person's left hand, because they would be turned and facing you.
Right.
But since it's a self-portrait, remember that Rembrandt is looking into a mirror. And so that is actually his right hand.
That's actually the hand that he's in the act of painting with.
That's the hand that he paints with.
But has to portray it as not
Exactly.
painting.
So that's one reason why it might be more blurry and more loosely painted than the other hand.
Yes.
But we can also get more theoretical, because that right hand, as the painting hand, is the hand associated most with the medium, with the art of making painting. And so perhaps the painterly quality, that idea, as I said, of flesh becoming paint here is almost symbolic in a way, that Rembrandt is so engaged with painting as the king of painting after so many years as a successful painter, that it's as if he himself is turning into paint.
Yeah, I mean, imagine a career of painting for, 40 or 50 years of painting just about every day, and in a way being much more engaged in the making of paint than any artist today would be.
Right.
It is true that toward the end of his life, Rembrandt has an amazing facility with it, so that he can brush it on in the loosest way, and it really so quickly represents what he wants it to represent. I mean, it's really an amazing thing.
It is an amazing thing, and I think the way that hand stands out as so painterly, literally being paint, I think really drives that message home. And, he's in his 50s. He's about 52 when he paints this. He's starting slowly to get towards the mature ages of his life and his later years. And
in fact, most people didn't even live this long, I think.
Exactly. He's pretty old for the time. And so it's interesting to see how he gets even older, how this transition from flesh into paint becomes even more dramatic. And maybe the starkest example is this very, very late self-portrait. This is from 1669.
This is actually the year
the year that he dies. And here you can see literally that, it's as if there is no more flesh. He has become all paint. His face is dissolving into pigment, into the paint, as if it's squeezed directly out of the tube, as we would do it. And that the physical person has been subsumed into painting
It's
completely.
almost like he's a ghost or a specter,
exactly,
in a way,
because
made
he's
out of
been
paint.
so overcome by the material of his profession. One way to think of this also is that maybe it's a reference to a classical antiquity and a story from the antique, that the painter Zeuxis was, in his old age, painting a portrait of a very old woman and laughing, and that was actually how he died. And so maybe this very late painting that Rembrandt is making of himself laughing like this is a reference to that
To
greatest
that
of
myth.
painters from classical antiquity.
Mhm.